Throughout the 1700s and 1800s in America, many of our native wildlife populations were decimated by what are known as market hunters. American bison, elk, deer, pronghorn, moose, bighorn sheep, and several bird species were hunted to near extinction for their meat, hides, and feathers. If there was a dollar to be made from the harvest of any part of these animals, there were men who were dedicated to killing and harvesting as many as possible. Many of these men would go on excursions that would last months and sometimes even years. Named aptly for the length of their outings, many of these men were known as the Long Hunters. For perspective, bison used to roam the American plains in herds so large that there were first-hand accounts of travelers having to wait several days for the herd to pass so they could continue on with their travels. Now, there are only estimated to be about 500,000 bison left in the country, with less than 25,000 of them being true wild herds and the rest being commercial, farm-raised herds. Prior to the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, the United States had little to no laws set in place to provide protection to our native wildlife populations. In the conquest of Western expansion, ecological consideration was completely overshadowed. The lack of these laws and regulations led to what can only be described as mass slaughter. These market hunters were not the modern sportsmen we picture today. They were groups of men who dedicated their lives to the slaughter of these animals in order to make a buck anywhere and in any way they could. This time frame is actually when we coined the term buck to mean $1. During the boom of the buckskin market, many well-kept deer hides were sold by market hunters for roughly $1 per piece. Many of these commodities were being bought to transport back to Europe for their own personal manufacturing purposes. Buckskins were often tanned without hair to be used as a leather product. Beaver pelts were utilized for their soft underwool to make felt hats, and buffalo hides were often used to make heavy-duty leather belts for machinery, which was in incredibly high demand during the rise of the industrial age. The mass slaughter of these buffalo represented the broader ecological and cultural consequences of industrial-scale hunting. This massively changed many parts of the different American ecosystems. The Native Americans' approach to hunting was much more conservative, killing only what their tribes needed and utilizing every part of the animal to ensure nothing went to waste, effectively maintaining the balance between humans as an apex predator and the native wildlife populations. As the market hunters stepped in, and with the rise of deadlier and deadlier weaponry, these wildlife populations stood virtually no chance at equilibrium. Towards the late 1800s, America was a nation faced with the reality that their wildlife was nearly gone. In 1887, Theodore Roosevelt co-founded the Boone and Crockett Club to address the concerns of declining wildlife populations. This club aimed to change the ideology of the American hunter. This club focused heavily on promoting the ideas of restraint, stewardship, fair chase, and conservation. In the book American Big Game Hunting, the book of the Boone and Crockett Club, which was edited by Theodore Roosevelt and George Bird Grinnell, who was a notable anthropologist, historian, and naturalist, it states on the first page what the objects of the club shall be, with 5 main objectives, the last 3 being the most notable. Rule 3 was to work for the preservation of the large game in this country, and, so far as possible, to further legislation for that purpose and to assist in the enforcing of the existing laws. Rule 4 was to promote inquiry into and to record observations on the habits and natural history of the various wild animals. And Rule 5 was to bring about among the members the interchange of opinions and ideas on hunting, travel, exploration, on the various kinds of hunting rifles, on the haunts of game animals, etc. But ideology alone was not enough to save our wildlife. It had to be written into law. Driven to put an end to the ruthless slaughter, the first federal law to protect wildlife was born, the Lacey Act. The Lacey Act was created by Congressman John Lacey and was signed into law by President William McKinley on May 25, 1900. The Lacey Act prohibited the interstate transportation of illegally taken game and importation of injurious species. The major turnaround in wildlife conservation came with the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. In 1903, he created the first federal bird reservation, which later turned into the National Wildlife Refuge System. In 1906, Roosevelt passed the Antiquities Act, which allowed Roosevelt to proclaim millions upon millions of acres of land as national monuments. In 1908, Roosevelt established the National Bison Range in Montana. This was the first time that the U.S. had ever appropriated tax dollars purely for the efforts of wildlife conservation. Later on, in 1918, we get the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This brought forth not only a national effort, but an international effort to protect migratory bird species within their international seasonal travels. The U.S. had finally started to redirect their attitude towards wildlife in a way that favored preservation over profit. This also shifted the tide for the way that the American people viewed their own role within the natural world. In 1949, Aldo Leopold, an American writer and philosopher, published A Sand County Almanac, which is seen as a cornerstone of modern conservation ideology. Much like the efforts of the Boone and Crockett Club, A Sand County Almanac used a collection of essays to advocate for land ethic, which was the idea that we as humans should view ourselves as working elements of our larger ecological environment as opposed to conquerors of it. This also encouraged further study, understanding, and exploration of ecology and conservation. In A Sand County Almanac, while reminiscing about his local bird populations, Aldo himself states, "There was a time in the early 1900s when Wisconsin farms nearly lost their immemorial timepiece, when May pastures greened in silence and August nights brought no whistled reminder of impending fall. Universal gunpowder, plus the lure of plover on toast for post-Victorian banquets, had taken too great a toll. The belated protection of the federal migratory bird laws came just in time." These laws and ideologies massively turned the tides for our native wildlife populations. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has continued to work towards conservation of fish, wildlife, and their habitats in the U.S. under a user-funded, science-based management system. Every individual state has also adopted their own wildlife management agencies to follow suit. There have also been incredible amounts of support for these agencies with smaller conservation groups, one of the most notable being the National Wild Turkey Federation, founded in 1973. The National Wild Turkey Federation have facilitated in one of the most substantial species recovery programs ever implemented in the United States, successfully rebounding from a historical low of an estimated 200,000 wild turkeys to now nearly 7 million across every state except for Alaska. With implementations of regulated hunting licenses, public land management, close consideration of wider-scale ecological impacts, and countless other factors, we have successfully created one of, if not the most efficient and practical wildlife management systems in the world. We have successfully recovered nearly every native land mammal that was brought to near extinction from the market hunters of the 1700s and 1800s to now sustainable levels. Today, we still fight for this recovery as well as protection against the rapidly changing world we currently live in, as many populations are being threatened by things like land development, disease, and economic interests. With all of these changes, our wildlife agencies now use hunters as a vital tool in their management, research, and analysis of our wildlife populations. The ideologies set forth by those such as Aldo Leopold and Teddy Roosevelt still resonate today, and for some are amplified. Many modern hunters view conservation as a necessity, in that we must learn to responsibly harvest with great care and consideration for how our individual actions affect these animals and ecosystems on a grand scale to ensure that we preserve these resources for both ourselves and future generations to come. With such a massive shift in how the American people approach wildlife conservation and protection, it's important that we learn from our own faults in history and ask ourselves, will future generations look back on us the way that we look at the market hunters, or will they look back on us as the generation who realized why it matters and saved the wild?